So, uh, I just finished Saving Christmas with Kirk Cameron, and yeah, like bar none, it's the worst movie I've ever seen. I see why it was rated so poorly on IMDb, just purely from a filmmaking perspective. It's hot garbage. It opens with like a 5 minute sermon of Kirk Cameron sitting by a fireplace, talking directly to the camera, and telling us a bunch of very vague stuff about how Christmas is under attack, like typical war on Christmas rhetoric that doesn't even make any sense. It contradicts itself repeatedly, and it's always unclear who he's actually talking about. And then it goes into an actual movie where he's trying to reason with a guy who hates Christmas, but he's not the one who's like not telling people not to say Merry Christmas. He's a Christian who thinks that the roots of Christian Christmas celebrations are pagan, which most of them are. And so it, as is typical, I'm finding with these movies, there is a way to do what this movie's trying to do in in an interesting and a helpful way. I'll come back to that. Of course, at the end of the movie, he realizes that he's been terrible, and he, thanks to Kirk Cameron's help, wants to celebrate and enjoy Christmas. And so then, like, that happens with like 20 minutes left in the movie. So I'm sitting here wondering, like, what is the rest of the movie? Like, we've reached the end. Well, the entire last 20 minutes of an hour and 20-minute movie is an extended, very bad dance routine, and then like a meal. And over this, I think at least twice in this last 20 minutes, Kirk Cameron does voiceovers telling us, you know, Jesus is the reason for the season and all this stuff. But back to so like, again, just purely as a film, it's very badly done. But it's the theology part that really bothered me. Because again, like if you know anything about history, you know that the day that we celebrate Christmas, and most of the things like wreaths and Yule logs and Christmas trees, all of those things were appropriated from pagan celebrations. And yet this movie can't acknowledge that. And it kind of almost starts to, like he acknowledges that the pagans celebrate a winter solstice festival and that that's when Christmas is. But rather than acknowledging that, yeah, that's something that the church did on purpose, he does this really weird thing. He says, well, you know, God invented the winter solstice. He's like, well, sure. But that's not why we celebrate Christmas at the winter solstice. Like, it's not like we have in Genesis when God establishes the moon and the stars and the sun so that to mark festival days. It's not like then God says, and make sure during the winter solstice you celebrate light coming back into the world. Like, that's not a holiday that we see the Jewish people celebrating that then morphed into their Christmas tradition. Unlike, say, like Passover and Easter, which are explicitly connected. And then again, we added some pagan stuff even onto Easter, right? But at least with Easter and Passover, we have a clear biblical link. We don't have that with Christmas. Like, scholars pretty much universally agree Jesus was probably born in like September, October, just based on clues that Luke gives us in his gospel. And sure, it doesn't really matter what day it was, but I think it does matter that we appropriated a lot of this from pagans. Like, if we're trying to be honest about how we celebrate, that's something that should matter. Particularly if we're trying to be respectful neighbors to our friends and family who are pagans. Like, if we basically say, well, we were doing the right thing all along and you're just stupid and wrong, it doesn't acknowledge the truth of our tradition. It also doesn't acknowledge the violence that's been done against pagans in the name of Christianity. So again, there's a lot of problems with the way this movie does that. And beyond that, Kirk Cameron keeps insisting that there's truth to be proclaimed here, and yet he consistently undermines what is true in favor of essentially like mind games. So when I was a youth pastor, I loved playing this game with my students. We would call it instant devotionals, and I would give them a challenge. I would say, you know, we're in the van going into a youth trip somewhere, or we're like at a service project and working on stuff, and I'd say, find the weirdest things you can, and I'm going to do an instant devotional out of it. So they would, like, you know, point at a fire hydrant, and I would have to come up off the top of my head with some way that a fire hydrant reminded us of Jesus. And then, of course, once I had done 2 or 3, I would give them some to try to do, and it was fun because, of course, like there's no inherent link between those two things, but it was fun. It was a fun exercise to try to say, can we find something sacred in the ordinary? That is essentially what Kirk Cameron is doing with Christmas things. Like he does that with Christmas trees and says, oh no, Christmas trees aren't pagan. Actually, they're from the Garden of Eden. Now, it's true that there is a tree of life in the Garden of Eden, but that's not where the Christmas tree in the Christmas celebration came from. So, yeah, that's a nice thing to think about, and it's kind of a fun thing to do, but that's not the obvious connection there. That's a connection that you are choosing to make in the present. And to claim that if you don't make that connection that you somehow hate Christmas or certainly, again, not to acknowledge the pagan roots of something like a Christmas tree, is just, again, it's silly, it's falsehood, it's needlessly shaming. And he does weird stuff too. Again, for folks that claim that they're all about the Bible, they do weird stuff, like where he makes a lot. Like, I think this is something that someone thought of or heard in a sermon one time, and it blew their mind, so they decided to include it in this movie, where they linked the swaddling cloth that Jesus is wrapped in, which is mentioned in Luke's gospel, with the cloth that Jesus' body is wrapped in for burial. And then, again, he explicitly makes a link that Nicodemus brings the cloth. Well, that's true. Nicodemus does that in the Gospel of John, but John doesn't even have a birth narrative. Luke doesn't have the character of Nicodemus bringing any sort of cloth. So what you're doing is pulling two details from 2 different Gospels that had 2 different literary agendas and forcing those things together. It just doesn't work that way. Again, it's a neat thing to do, but it's not biblically sound. And it actually reminds me of Batman v Superman, when Batman decides not to kill Superman because their moms have the same last name. And you just know that some screenwriter somewhere was like, wait a second, their moms are both named Martha. Whoa! You know, they thought that was so cool and interesting. It's not. It's just like a fun coincidence that like 100 people have noticed before. So anyway, yeah, this movie's bad theology. It also doesn't critique materialism. It actually comes back around and says that materialism is good because Jesus took on a material body. So they literally use the incarnation to defend materialism at Christmas. And they have one throwaway line about don't max out your credit cards. But again, in a culture that is so consuming and consumer oriented and so materialistic, one of the beautiful things about insisting on celebrating Advent as a particular time of fasting and preparation before Christmas is it teaches us the rhythms of fasting and feasting that help us resist consumerism and materialism. And what this movie essentially does is shoves all that away and says, all we should be doing is feasting, and it's okay. And then again, it gives us like this one little throwaway line about credit cards, but it fails to look at the reality that credit card debt, especially during the Christmas season, is something that people really struggle with. So rather than providing a holy alternative, which is what a Christian Christmas movie maybe should be doing, it just feeds into the dominant cultural narrative of the consumerism and materialism and baptizes it in a way. So I think this movie is actively evil. I think it actually does harm to the Christmas story. And I think it replaces what the Christmas season is really about with cheap sentimentality and hand-wavy magic tricks of interpretation that don't actually stand up to any kind of serious consideration of Scripture. So I hated this movie. I think it might be my least favorite movie I've ever seen. So good job, everyone that chose this movie as the donor pick. Yeah, I love you so much, and I hate you right now. But I survived saving Christmas. I survived the 20-minute ending. I think it ended for longer than Lord of the Rings did. And I'm going to be watching a Godwink Christmas, maybe this afternoon or probably maybe later in this week, as soon as I have a chance again. So that'll be the next double feature. We are getting closer and closer to our fundraising goal for Nick Cage's Left Behind movie, and then a super fun extra feature there as well. So again, by all means, feel free to contribute if you haven't. Thanks for watching this stupid video. Hopefully you never have to watch Saving Christmas, because it's the worst. Happy Halloween.